Thanks a lot for that. At this point, halfway, just about, we're going to hand over to Ian Cable, who I believe is sharing his screen already, so you should all be able to see that now. And so without further ado, I think I'm going to hand over to Ian, if that's all right. Ian, you there?
Yeah, I am. Yeah, thanks, Judah. That's really great. And thanks, Angie. It's really great to see what the Environment Agency does. We are really proud to be part of such an ambitious organisation, kind of world leading as well, which is really good. My name's Ian Cable. I work in the Executive Correspondence Unit, and I deal with correspondence and complaints that go to Emma Howard Boyd and James Bevan. But today I'm going to talk to you as the education lead for the Collective for Climate Action about climate change, COVID, where we are, and what we can do about it. So, stop changing. There we go. Yeah, just to start off with, this year, Dasgupta review was published, and that was commissioned by the Bank of England. So finance people are starting to look at, or they have been looking at, how climate is, the interaction between the economic system and climate. And what they found was, in the 22 years leading up to 2014, our produced capital, which is basically the stuff we make, increased by 2 times. So we doubled the amount of stuff that we produced. And our human capital, which basically equates to our ability to, make our lives better by doing work that's good for us and making money, that only increased by 13%. But in the same time, in those 22 years, our natural capital fell by 40%. So we've taken almost half of nature's ability to provide us with what we need in just 22 years. So there's quite alarming statistics that they found, and it just shows that we have a lot to do, basically. And we are doing quite a lot. As it turns out, increasing investment in renewables is a growing pattern. We can see here that China is one of the really big players, and actually they're largely responsible for the precipitous kind of fall in the price of solar. But they invest in wind and nuclear and hydro, and obviously they run their country in a very different technocratic way to other countries in the world. So they see a problem and they get engineers and scientists to help them fix it. And obviously they tell everyone what to do. But also, what are we doing in the UK? Well, just as Naomi said earlier, we've reduced our emissions by 42%, and we've still grown the economy by 72% since 1990. I mean, that's a phenomenal effort. And we've got no more coal in our energy mix anymore. We've got wind, gas, nuclear imports, which is largely nuclear coming from France, and we've got a bit of biomass and water. But we don't count our consumption emissions, and we'll go on to that a little bit later. But basically, one of the things that we've done to reduce our emissions is shutting down a lot of our heavy industry, and obviously divorcing ourselves from coal. But you can only cut coal once. So we're not going to be able to pull that low-hanging fruit off the tree again. And what we've done by exporting our emissions is basically the things we consume, their footprint is emitted by other countries. And at the moment, we're not really counting that. But it'd be disingenuous to say that we're not reducing our emissions, but we're not counting some of the really big factors that contribute to how intensive our economy is. So the other thing to remember is it's not just about climate. We're putting tremendous pressure on all of the Earth's ecosystems, and we need to manage our land better. We're still in parts of the UK extracting peat for like garden compost. We're still not allowing our moors to regenerate properly. Our forests that we're planting, and we've got some of the lowest forest rates in Europe. I think it may be the lowest. And carbon capture from growing more trees, that's not going to materialise for another 20 to 30 years because they have to get to a certain size before they really start to add biomass and regenerate the soils. Also, farmland is still a really big emitter, and not even in terms of fossil fuels. If we think about the pesticides and the fertiliser that goes on, then those get into our watercourses and they eutrophy our watercourses and oceans. And one of the problems that we're getting now is we're getting kind of anoxic zones in our coastal waters around the UK. And that's a global problem, to be fair. But one of the reasons is our fertilisers get in there, and basically the algae grow really, really quickly, and they suck up all the oxygen. And so large fish and large marine organisms can't live there anymore. So it's bad for the fishing industry too. And if you get a chance, I watched it this weekend, it's really incredible, and it's worrying as well. But the Oceanspiracy documentary on Netflix is very, very good. And it really shows just how easily we can get distracted by problems that look more fixable compared to ones which may be the actual driving force behind the issues that we're seeing materialise in front of us. So as I said earlier, the UK is really good at importing CO2. So basically on the things that we consume from other countries. I mean, maybe you'll be able to see here that actually we're one of the worst countries in the world for importing things from other countries and just offshoring the emissions and making them do our dirty work for us. And if you look without imports, in 1972, we peaked in terms of our emissions production. But with imports, it was much delayed. And that was 2007 that actually happened. And so we look at why these kinds of things are. And, you know, greenhouse gases, it's not just about CO2, but that's also linked, all greenhouse gases are linked to, you know, our energy production and our just production of stuff. CO2 is the main one for generating energy, of course. But when we look at, you know, what we're doing in terms of generating energy, we're just consuming more and more. Even though we become more efficient at using it, what often happens, I don't know if everyone understands the idea of Jevons's paradox, but basically the more efficient something is to produce or to use, the more often we would use it. So, you know, you could drive an energy efficient car or a fuel efficient car to Scotland quite happily, but if it only got you 50 miles, you wouldn't want to stop and refuel it every 50 miles. So if it's an inefficient one, you just use it a lot less. And what this means, though, about it not just being about CO2, is that everyone goes on about the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And we did cross the 400 threshold a few years ago. And that's like a milestone. But the real thing to remember is that we've also got methane and nitrous oxide too. And with those ones combined into it, we're at 500 parts per million of the equivalent if it was all CO2. So we were at 280 before industrial emissions started happening with the Industrial Revolution. And within about 10 years, we will be at double that. And that's important because if we double the amount of CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere or the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we're looking at 2.6 to 3.9 degrees increase in temperatures. Now, that's obviously shows that 1.5 is not on the cards anymore because we are almost certain to double our emissions levels in the atmosphere. So that's something to remember. Our objective is not going to be just to get to net zero. It's to shoot past net zero and start pulling stuff out of the atmosphere. And these kind of things are getting recognised. Like the UN has decreed that now you can actually claim asylum, so to migrate from one country to another based on the impacts of climate change. And we can see impacts around the world. And here we can see that in I can't even know what it's called, Arabatu, this one of those islands that's now often gets inundated completely with seawater just from rising seas. So those people are seeking asylum in other countries now. And we should expect this not just from rising seas, but also from famines, you know, through less predictable rain patterns, giving us year-on-year droughts in, you know, the grain baskets of the world. So let's think about the impact of COVID. Well, I mean, we've seen relative inaction since we first understood the climate crisis or the climate change in the 50s. We started modelling it really well in the 60s. And then we even started seeing really sharp rises in the 1980s, but we still hadn't really done much about it. At the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of optimism coming from environmentalists and kind of greener economists saying that, you know, with the stimulus packages that we're going to be producing inevitably to try and get the economies going again, it's a great opportunity to really try and, you know, green up the economy and change our direction. But this is what always happens after big kind of climate-based environmental milestones, like it happened after Paris. But what often happens is things start to quieten down and return to normal. And that's what we've seen now. It hasn't really materialized in terms of government spending. What we've actually done is we're just trying to reboot the economy. And that's kind of to be expected, really, because, you know, we've got a fossil fuel economy and still, you know, all of our emissions are still entailed, not in just what we produce in the UK or energy we produce, but also in the things we consume from other countries and our transport as well. So it's to be expected that we're just going to use our money to go back to where we were before. And then we will see people have started thinking differently though. And that may have been stimulated by COVID or the lockdown, but we're also seeing that economics are starting to change. So, you know, there's a huge amount of conversations went on about greening the economy through these stimulus packages. And as a result, you know, the conversations really have changed. And economists largely now understand that if you don't green up, you're basically done. So, you know, if decarbonisation is inevitable, and it's just about how fast you do it, as opposed, which is the real question as to how successful you're going to be in future. And it's just balancing the cost of doing it in the first place with how quickly you do it in terms of trying to get as much market share in future as you can. One thing as well that's happened outside of COVID really is that interest rates have stayed low. Since the economic crisis, governments just squished interest rates really low and they haven't really seemed to rebound. So that could be good in terms of increasing lending to positive carbon industries or climate positive industries. So that could be good. But over the year, when we look back at it, we've actually cut our emissions for 1 year by 7%. I think the UK at one point was 17%. I think it was in April or something last year. But over the year, it was about 7%. And as I said, that all came from just shutting things down. There was no real transition to a greener economy. So now those things are opening back up again, and we'll just see a rebound to back where we were. But one of the other things as well is we might see a change in how governments run the country. So we've got a Conservative government at the moment that seems happier to spend more money on public goods. So we could see things change going forward, but it's really uncertain. But looking at the carbon data and carbon dioxide data in the atmosphere, this is like the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii, and they've been looking at this for a really long time. But as you can see, the trajectory is pretty positive, going up in terms of adding carbon to the atmosphere. And actually, when you look at 2020, we don't really see much of a drop at all. And there's a chap called Mike Berners-Lee, whose brother invented the internet. He's a climate scientist himself, wrote No Planet B, the book. And in an interview I heard with him a couple of weeks ago, about a month ago now, he was saying that the emissions reductions that we've done under COVID, they've brought us about 3.5 weeks in terms of getting to net zero. So we really haven't made that much. It really hasn't made that much difference. And as we can see here, it's just been a case of us shutting down energy demand. So it's just dropped off really, really deep, really steeply here. But at the same time, actually what's happening is, this is a Nature paper looking at our energy usage. It's just expected to take a little blip and then just carry on as it was before. But there are societal changes happening. So it's important to remember that, people are now much more convinced about climate. We can see there's some really big players here, like Brazil, China, us not so big, but this year we are, very noticeable. Germany, Australia, India, the United States, all of them, red and orange, people at least thinking that humans are partly responsible or mainly responsible for the climate crisis. So that's a really positive change. Also looking at whether people would fly in future after the pandemic, this may have stimulated people to think more about, what we can actually have on our own doorstep. But in the United Kingdom, it's looking like 30% of people wouldn't fly as much after the pandemic. India is obviously a massive one. There'd be an area for growth in flying, so that's quite positive as well. Also, flying is one of those ones that, as an individual, to make a change, it's possibly the most conspicuous one you can do, and it really does make people think. So that's a really good change in the kind of thinking about our relationship with emissions. One of the other sides of the COVID problem is that obviously people aren't going to want to use public transport. So, we've got a massive uptick in people projecting they would use their own vehicles to get around instead of using public transport. They don't want to get sick by sharing cabins with other people. So long and short of it is, it's not really made much of a difference. We can see that China's rebounded much more quickly here because they shut their economy down earlier and more successfully opened it back up again. But their emissions are now 4% higher than they were pre-COVID. And we're looking to surpass pre-COVID levels of fossil fuel emissions pretty soon around the world. So again, it's not to look at COVID as having been anything that's helped us or that's made us solve anything, but it has started to really explode the debate about what people want to do with their lives and what governments may think is useful. I mean, one of the things we've seen is obviously governments are very happy to spend money on public goods now to really get us out of trouble. And that could change the thinking around what we do going forward. So is capitalism the problem? Well, our type of capitalism definitely is a problem because it's got a massive problem in it. It's the market failure that just doesn't protect the environment. There's little or no incentive to preserve the environment in many countries around the world. And even in our own country, we still have very degraded ecosystems. All you have to do is look at the Lake District, which is heavily subsidized, and it's obviously covered in sheep, and there's almost no natural habitat there at all. They even tried to get World Heritage status a few years ago for natural beauty, but the UN were just like, there's no reason for us to offer you that because you've basically got a massively degraded environment. So they've gone back. I don't know whether they're successful, but they wanted to do it as a culturally significant status because of sheep farming. But the thing about our economy is it consumes nature. It doesn't consume the surplus that nature provides us with. So it's like instead of living off the interest, we're just eating into our savings. And obviously we'll get less and less from our savings as time goes on, and eventually we'll eat them down to almost nothing. But there is a growing economic consensus that we need capitalism, because we just can't change course quick enough to bring in a whole new system. And it would just, well, it's questionable that anyone would want to. But at the same time, we just need one that values the environment, that pays to restore it. And this will make things more expensive because it's a cost that we've ignored in the past. But in the short term, it will cost us more. But like we're finding with things like regenerative farming, once we adapt to those types of farming, you won't need many of the other costs. Like a lot of it is down to needing new seeds from large agri-producers and fertilizers that you wouldn't need because the soil is healthier and you'll get more nutritious food out of it, will grow more abundantly. You won't need as much equipment if you're doing no-till farming. So this will reduce the cost of agriculture, certainly. Still, it's difficult to cost the ecosystem services, but it will probably be some kind of combination of how much value that we derive from natural ecosystems pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and out of the oceans, and also how much it helps us to produce food and materials, and also in terms of neutralizing pollution. You know, these are a lot of the things that the environment provides for us. And these guys here, I spoke to a chapter on carbon capture the other day, and they're making their product from growing macroalgae in the oceans, and they reckon that it's about £200 per ton to suck a ton of carbon dioxide out of the oceans. And Climeworks are another company. They're the ones that have those massive fans that basically suck carbon or strip carbon dioxide out of the atmospheric air, and then they bury it in the ground, reacting it with basalt to make like a carbonate that's just like staple carbon and won't go anywhere. These guys are doing the same thing, but if you look, £1,000 a ton and £200 a ton, you know, there's a lot of money, and they're trying to come up with, they're always trying to bring those prices down. But so it's hard to quantify exactly. How much, you know, benefit we're going to get, or costing the benefit we get from the environment. But one of the other things to remember is that the government really does need our help. Between 2008 and 2018, the UK's emissions reduced by 28%, which is really great. And as Naomi and Angie were saying earlier, that's faster than any other G20 economy. And we've got a legally binding commitment to reduce our emissions by 80% by 2050. And I know we've gone for net zero by 2050, but we're not meeting those targets at the moment. So we're breaking our own laws. But the real problem is governments don't really feel mandated by the public to put climate above other problems, because it's still not this immediate, or it's not seen as this immediate problem, and it's expensive to fix, and it'd be quite disruptive to really address it. But we need more honesty. We need the government to talk more openly about where we actually are, and we also need to make sure that we've got our eyes fixed on the real destination, and that is pre-industrial levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Because if we stop where we are now, then that's great, but we still have the oceans becoming acidified. You know, we still have unstable weather patterns. I'll go into that a little bit later. But the Public Accounts Committee, they did their inquiry that they published in the results form in March 21, and they said that the government set its targets 2 years ago, but they still have no plan to reach net zero. We've got no milestones to measure them against, and we're not considering net zero in future projects. We're not ensuring that the actions don't just force emissions overseas through our consumption emissions. And also, we need positive discount rates. And there's one thing that we used actually in the last IPCC report. They use these models called integrated climate models. And basically what they have at the heart of them is economics and that relationship with the environment. And one of the things that economic model inside that model does is it says that we have a discounting rate for future action on what the cost would be today. So basically, you think any technology we need to do this decarbonisation, we're going to be better at doing it in future. It's going to be cheaper for us to do it in the future because we're going to be better at doing it. It's going to be more efficient. And also in future, the economy is going to be bigger, so we're going to be richer. So not only are we richer, it'll be cheaper for us to do all these things in the first place anyway. So it's better, it's the most pragmatic thing, is to leave it until later and let someone else deal with it. But now, the Public Accounts Committee said that is wrong, and also academics are starting to say that is wrong, because it's very likely, it's almost inevitable, that we are going to have less resource. We're going to have less time in future and less resources, possibly less money floating around in the economies to lend and shuffle around to get these technologies up and running. They also said that we need systemic change, and the government's still relying on individual choices to a large extent to actually make the changes that we need to make as a country. And that could be fine, but it's hard to get people to volunteer to do these things, especially when they're expensive to do. Like replacing a gas boiler in your house, buying an electric vehicle. Those are really expensive things for individual people to do. But we need changes to our energy, travel, agriculture, heating, and also our oceans as well. We're still managing them really badly. And again, if I hasten you to like point you towards watching that documentary on Netflix, it really does show you how extractive we are, how much we are pulling out of our natural ecosystems. And the other thing to remember is that we live in a fossil fuel economy. So anything that we do at this point, it has a footprint. So even the Environment Agency's really amazingly ambitious Emissions 2030, world-leading carbon cutting program, I think we're still looking, correct me if I'm wrong at some point, but we're still looking at 45% of our emissions being offset. And that's just because everything we do has some sort of climate impact, because something is made of fossil fuels somewhere along the line. So one of the problems is the rates of action. And as we can see here, there are some really big players here who are not doing any more. This is for the Paris commitments. And COP26 was going to be a really big milestone for this, because it was the one where everyone comes back with more ambition to show that they are committing to this process, and that we're increasing our ambition year on year, well, every 5 years anyway. And what happens at the moment is, Europe's recommitted. We're more ambitious. Got some of South America, parts of Africa, and that's largely it. America's coming back online, so I'm sure they'll turn dark green soon. China's light green. That's because they haven't properly made the commitment, but they've talked about their 2060 commitments, which actually could take about 0.3 of a degree off global warming, because they're such huge emitters. And there's something really promising about China, is that they tend to under-promise what they're going to do and then over-commit or over-deliver. So even though they're not committed there on paper, they're actually likely to be probably more important than all of these other countries put together. But the important thing to take away from there is there are some big players like Russia and Brazil that just aren't on board with this. And we know they've got governments that aren't really in favour of climate action anyway. Russia's a petro-state, and obviously Brazil's not short of oil, but they obviously want to use the Amazon as much as they can. Bolsonaro doesn't like other people in other countries telling what to do. So I'll just try and cut this video. This is the importance of the speed of acting now. So we can just see, starting back at, this isn't really pre-industrial, when they start in 1880, I'm not sure what the date was starting, 1850. Really true in pre-industrial times was somewhere in the 1700s, before the Industrial Revolution really started. But you can see just how quickly we are chewing through our 1.5 degree budget. And that's the important thing to remember. We're not on, it's not a slow and steady line going up. It is dramatically accelerating all the time. And it really does, it's important to remember that we're slowing down that increase slightly, but we're still not reducing the amount of carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere together with other greenhouse gases. So the other thing to remember as well is in 2014, when the UN produced their AR5 report, they gave us a 33% of catastrophic failure, a 2 in 3 chance of actually making it so that we could keep things under 1.5 degrees. But now it's looking increasingly unlikely that we are going to keep things under 2 degrees. It looks impossible, to be perfectly honest. But that's why we need to have not our goal as net zero, but our goal is net negative. And the real thinking behind that is that, the importance of thinking behind that is that it would be like making all the preparations to swim the channel, having all the support network and the infrastructure that you needed, like the support boat, doing all the training, and then just getting halfway and then just stopping. Because really, net zero has to be a stop on the way, because if we leave things really warm and, leave all of that extra energy being trapped in the atmosphere all the time, that CO2 just blanketing everything in, then we are going to have more of those problems of famines, migration, increased likelihood of war, and all the other great, and ocean acidification. So we really do need to be getting that CO2 out of the atmosphere. But it's hard for governments to make these changes, because doing them fast really is going to be expensive for voters. It's going to cost people something, and it's really hard for people to come to terms with the idea of voting someone in who's not going to make their lives materially richer. There we go. So what about net zero? I've just kind of covered it really, kind of ahead of myself. But one of the things to remember is that, there are some positives to getting to net zero. Obviously, it's on our trajectory. It's where we need to be going. But this chap here, McDougall, I heard him being interviewed the other day, and he's a climate scientist talking about where we stop in terms of temperature is where we'll stay. So at least if we stop producing carbon dioxide, our temperatures will remain where we got to net zero largely, because a lot of the feedbacks in the climate system, they are things that they respond quite slowly. And also there are other things as well, like the cost of PV or photovoltaic cells has fallen by 99% in the last 40 years. So now it's actually cheaper to stick solar panels onto a solar array than it is to stick coal into a coal-fired power station. And people talk about, we know enough to do this. We've got the tools. We've got the tools to deal with the climate crisis. But really, we don't have the tools at the moment. It's like we've got the parts of a hammer, but we don't actually have a hammer. So we know the technology we need, but we don't really have it in any scale. We know what nature we need, but we still have very degraded ecosystems that can't actually do the work of pulling carbon dioxide, CO2 out of the atmosphere. And we don't have the infrastructure we need to try and get like carbon capture or captured carbon to places where it can be injected into the geology. And we don't have functional regulatory systems yet. In fact, I was at it was a government presentation about carbon capture a few months ago. Took a morning off for that of work, and what happened was they were talking about some of the entrepreneurs in there were talking about how they're going to move to the United States because we just don't have a regulatory regime that will actually help them to grow as a business. So the future is uncertain, but we know that we're going to have less time. We're probably going to have less materials, and we could even have less trust in the banking system, so we can have less money floating around the economy to actually lend around and help things grow. So, to talk about the collective climate action a little bit, we're cross-government. We've got over 200 different organisations that are attached to us now. We've got different groups. So we've got a councils group. We've got over 100 councils in our on our Slack workspace now, and we're now kind of the chosen platform for the Local Government Association and Climate Action UK to get councils on there and talking. We've got different, obviously, like parts to it, like content engagement, research, helping us to do things better, inclusivity, human systems to help with behavioural change. We're looking at growth a lot this year. We've got a growth week coming up in May, and I lead on the education side of things. But basically, we're trying to connect the entire of the public sector in a shared space. As the Committee for Climate Change said, councils needed. They need somewhere to communicate about what they're doing, and our Slack space is becoming that space. So, in terms of us being able to make a difference, we can make a difference, and you'll have heard this before, but we need to act now. But really, speed is the main thing now. It absolutely is. Literally, we're going to make mistakes. We've got to do whatever we do and learn fast. We've got to keep our eyes on the big wins because it's a global problem. So I had a bit of a think a little while ago. I was thinking about myself spending 15 quid on a zero waste razor when I use about one blade every 6 months anyway, because I'm so stingy. But basically, for that £15, I probably could have done, if I went to the Clean Air Task Force, I could have given them like $18 or $19 and sequestered or prevented almost 20 tons of CO2 from going into the atmosphere. Because those guys basically regulate the American fossil fuel and heavy industry to make sure that they produce less carbon dioxide. And they're rated as one of the highest impact charities for carbon or climate impacts. The other thing, it's going to take everyone. It's not just people working in climate, because they've done a sterling job up till now. But this is, I've got the video, but we won't hear the sound. This is Miles Allen from Oxford University. And he was saying that basically, thanks to Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future, I am now going to negotiate with the government about our net zero targets. So, even academics are really understanding how important this is. So with regards to us, or regards to what people can do as individuals, I think one of the things that would really help for a lot of people is to accept that the future is going to be a materially poorer one. But it doesn't have to mean that we have a worse future. I mean, if the lockdown has taught us anything, it's that people in our lives are one of the most important things that really do make us happy. And it's not just having a bunch of stuff around us that does. Also ask, do I need it? Like, if you don't need something, then just make sure that you really, really want it, because everything has a footprint, everything has environmental impact. And the World Economic Forum now, a bunch of billionaires who used to think that cheap finance was the way to solve the world's problems, now say that the most important thing you can do is join a group. Join one that you're passionate about. You don't even have to be an active member, but just be attached to something. And if you're really interested in what they do, then what you'll find is that you'll put more effort into doing it and you'll do a better job. But whatever group you do join the CFCA as well. You don't have to be an active member, but just having your name on our mailing list shows that you're another person on the ledger of public sector members who are calling for greater ambition in government action, but also praising what the government has already done before. We adopt that attitude of a critical friend as well. So celebrate what's already happened, but we're calling for more and more ambition. We've already got 220, 30 odd public sector organisations attached to us. But it's more than just a petition, we're also a community. But the final thing as well is write to your MP and vote on climate. We've got resources on our website to direct you to do that. It's just another organisation that specialises in this kind of thing. But it's so important that MPs and our government really understand the number of people who are on board with greater action on climate